I'm like, well, current web browsers, Microsoft or Netscape. Like, wait a minute, that's got to be old. And then I went down another rabbit hole and yada, yada, yada. Netscape ended in February of 2008. That's how old that website is. And so my guess was 15 years. I was just, like 1 or 2 years off.
All players, low down, active, bullseye, 1327. Post active.
Lights on.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to The Merge, where we make sense of defense. Well, we try, but we have a good time doing it. For those first-time listeners, check out our website in the show notes. It'll get you plugged into our newsletter. That's where the real gold mine is. And for those who are already on our crazy train, thanks for coming along for the ride. We put in the time to entertain you, and if you're not careful, you're going to learn something along the way. If you do us a solid, we spent a lot of time on these episodes. If you could spend the 10 seconds to give us a rating on iTunes or Spotify, wherever you get your pods. And if you don't have a feature to give us a rating, and if you spend an extra 10 seconds and go over to our YouTube channel, the link's in the show notes, click on the episode and tell us you like it. Bonus bro points if you just click on everything that in our channel and like it all. So there you go. I'm Mike, and in this episode, we've got Jake and Tim back on the mics. Our day jogs have been hectic. Our schedule has been keeping us busy, but we did it. We herded the cats. We're all here. Welcome, guys.
Woohoo!
Thanks for having us back, Mike.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's been a crazy few weeks, and so you weren't able to make it last episode. And so for Reader's Digest, the last episode we had two guests on to talk about how the Pentagon buys stuff. And so this episode is actually related to the last episode. We just theme's a little bit the same. It's just the other side of the coin. And so this time we're going to talk a little bit about the business side of that marketplace. And hopefully we're going to keep you conscious through all of that, and then we're going to jump into some headlines and some spicy takes from Jake. We'll see how that goes. Okay, to set the scene, we're actually going to start with an article this time, which is a little bit different. So there was a War on the Rocks article, links in the show notes, called Leveraging U.S. Capital Markets to Support the Future Industrial Network. That is a mouthful. So here's what it means. When it says capital markets, it means money. And when it talks about industrial network, it means businesses that are actually building solutions for the Department of Defense. What was interesting about this article had a lot of really good stuff, but the people who wrote it. So it was authored by three people and a few assistants, but the three people are retired Army General Joe Votel, who is now the CEO of BENS, which is the Business Executives for National Security, Frank Finelli, who works at the Carlyle Group, which, if you're not tracking that, is one of the largest private equity firms in the world. So something like $369 billion of assets. That's a lot of money. And then finally, Sam Cole, who is with Stonecutter Ventures. He co-founded it. He leads the investment arm of that. And that is a private equity firm that does seed stage defense tech investing. So seed stage being early, like putting seeds in the ground, so that you can grow some capabilities. Jake, do you actually know Sam by any chance?
I don't. No, and I've never worked with Stonecutter Ventures either. So,
okay, yeah, don't know anything about it. Don't know how new it is. I don't even know how big the VC industry is for defense. It can't be that big. That's why I was kind of asking. So, Jake, you're running Mark Ventures over there with your partners in crime.
it's a pretty small. I mean, venture is a tiny fraction of private equity, which is a tiny fraction of the capital markets. Private equity being, I think we covered this in episode 1. It's any investment really in a security that isn't publicly traded, so it's not in the stock market basically. And then defense is a tiny fraction of venture, so it's like a small corner of the world.
All right, so back to the point of the article, why we're actually talking about it today. Remember Jerry Maguire?
Show me the money!
So if you follow the money, that's usually where all the goodness is. And so at the end of the day, technology is great, but you need money to develop it, money to buy it, money to deploy it, money to operate it, and money to sustain it. So money drives everything. So why does this matter for today? 70% of all U.S. research and development is funded through private money, not the government. That is why we're talking about this today. In fact, I looked this up. The last when there was parity between public and private R&D spending every year, it was back when Bo Jackson was a rookie. That's in baseball and football in the 87-88 timeframe. So that's kind of the time frame that most of the federal government has been living in still, and it's 2023 now. And so this is this op-ed kind of dug into the rationale for leveraging that 70% of R&D capital being spent to solve some defense problems. So I'm going to hand it over to Jake to talk a little bit about his take on this op-ed.
So I think the breakdown between public and private R&D spending, it's interesting, right? So why the shift in 87, 88? Why was that the inflection point? I mean, it comes down to the end of the Cold War, right? So I mean, the trend had been gradual reductions in public R&D spend. And industry was slowly coming up to match, but really the public R&D spend was coming down faster than industry was going up. And that had been happening for a while throughout the 80s. But once you get into the late 80s, early 90s, collapse of the Soviet Union, the amount of government R&D spend is fairly de minimis when you compare it to the size of the capital markets. I can't remember the headline number in the article. I want to say it's, I don't know, in the trillions of dollars is like for the U.S. capital market. But I think that number is it's a bit of a red herring. It doesn't really help us here because that's money that people have invested in real estate and bonds and, Southwest Airlines, right? Like that money's not at scale going to move over into defense R&D spending.
Well, I don't think they're
Maybe
investing in Southwest Airlines just based on recent events.
Maybe we'll get to that later. I think it's a great buy. It's a great buy right now. This is not stock picking advice, by the way. But anyway, so that headline number sounds sexy, but like realistically, that money's not all moving into defense R&D. It's just never going to happen. But like the number that maybe is more realistic is the venture capital ecosystem has about 400 billion, maybe 300 billion today, sitting in the coffers of various venture capital firms. And if you broaden out to other private equity, so you look at sort of like buyout funds and mezzanine funds and debt funds, that number is probably much larger. It's probably in the low trillions in terms of money that's available to be invested. Most of those investors are not investing in defense, certainly not defense R&D, right? They're investing in car washes and all sorts of things that institutional investors invest in. But today, it's probably only like 1 or 2 billion a year in that venture bucket of 300 or 400 billion is going into defense. Maybe it's 3 billion, maybe it's 4 billion. But it's a tiny fraction. And so if you could encourage double the number of venture investors to actually care about the national security space, you could actually get another 4 or 5 billion into defense R&D. You compare that to what the federal government today spends on R&D for national security. So what does that number look like? There are lots of ways to calculate it, but DARPA's budget, for instance, is $3.5 billion. So you could basically create another DARPA overnight if you could get 1% of the venture dollars that aren't currently investing in defense to move into defense. And that seems like a relatively, not an easy lift or an easy ask, but it's certainly something that could be accomplished with the right government incentives. If you can sort of change the culture and change the perception that VCs have about defense investing.
Yeah, that's a good point. So the top line is for the Pentagon's what they call RDT&E budget, research, development, test, and evaluation. That is $130 billion. But that's the Pentagon's definition. The National Science Foundation definition uses the different terms of there's buckets of different, they call budget activities. And so if you actually take the scientific definition of R&D and apply it to the Pentagon's what they call R&D, it's about half that. So the Pentagon R&D, the technical R&D is actually 74 billion, which is a lot less than the 130 billion top line. And that's because they consider when the Pentagon buys stuff and it takes forever to field, by the time it fields, you're investing in upgrades to keep the thing relevant because it's already behind, it's losing relevancy the day it fields. So there's a lot of follow-on upgrades and stuff that is not technically research and development, but it's in the modernization of fielded weapon systems. So that's kind of one of the big differences. Interesting that you said about about DARPA. So $3.5 billion, that's a really good analogy. So if you had the entire defense venture capital ecosystem is basically the size of DARPA's budget. But then there's the private equity side too, which is probably ish equivalent to that, because there's a lot of small businesses that use private equity that don't rely on venture, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably larger. Like I said, private equity, venture is a tiny fraction of private equity overall. So if you're talking about the Carlyles of the world, like Carlyle is a private equity firm, or they certainly have a private equity arm of the firm. You know, that maybe is it's in the hundreds of billions, right? Just for that one firm. They're investing later stage than VCs. And so if you think of VCs investing in like TRL, I don't know, 3 through 6, like Carlyle is probably 7 through 9. So it's once a technology's already been proven in the lab, you've built the prototype, you're like ready to start testing it. You have some like customers, like Carlyle or private equity firms are coming in like post initial customer, or probably post program of record, and then giving a company, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars to scale up production. And VCs are coming in a little bit early. Both are kind of in the R&D phase, right? Or they're still in the startup phase. But if you could get those guys in, maybe you could get, I don't know, another 10, 20, 30 billion coming into defense relevant R&D every year. And that would be a real game changer.
Yeah. And for those who aren't really picking up what we're putting down, where the money comes from matters, because the incentives are completely different. And so if you have $1 that is in the budget for federal R&D, and let's say it's a low tech readiness level, they call basic research or applied research, or even advanced tech development, that's what they call 6.1, 6.2, and 6.3 money. That's the R in R&D. That's just research. It's also called science and technology. So that is like foundational research. Doesn't really deliver anything, but you're learning along the way. Most of that money, even though it goes to the Pentagon through the budget, the Pentagon actually gives it to colleges, universities, nonprofits, FFRDCs. And so it's actually not, most of it doesn't actually go to industry. And that's really one of the things that the op-ed highlighted. If people weren't aware, I mean, it's not a secret or anything. It's just how the money gets steered. And so that's not really incentivized to solve necessarily a problem. It's just to advance the body of knowledge in industry. And so that's kind of the incentives for that part of the budget. But when you get to the other parts of the budget, where you get to like the mid TRL, and so your research labs, or even they are restricted to like what levels of maturity for technology that they work in. But at the end of the day, the bumper sticker is that federal R&D transition rate. That means it leaves the lab and it actually goes somewhere, is terrible. There is no actual way to track it. There's no metrics of performance. There's never been any reporting on it. But through some vignettes and some research internally and some senior leader discussions, it's somewhere in the 3% transition rate. So 97% of the money spent in your early stage science and technology, it either dies in a filing cabinet after the research project is closed, or that body of knowledge, it's built, it kind of goes away, and then someone else builds on that, or that's lost, which mostly happens. That body of knowledge is lost somewhere, like 10 people are working on it. This 10 people's contract ended, or they graduated the university, and then someone else picks it up and has to relearn some of those the same lessons.
Or China buys it, right? The SBIR list is basically a shopping list for China.
That's right. It is. It is a shopping list for China. We'll get into trusted capital and OSC and some other interesting things in another episode. That is 100% correct.
This week I was actually at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab for an event where they're trying to figure out how they can better transition technology out of their lab. The event was, I believe, was hosted by Decisive Point and MIT's The Engine. And they brought a bunch of labs together. So I think Argonne National Labs was there, Idaho National Labs, Oak Ridge was there. They're trying to figure out how do you solve this problem, right? The FFRDCs, these national labs, they have a lot of money coming in. They're doing a lot of great fundamental research. They create a lot of IP, so they file patents on this stuff. Like you said, it just sits in the lab, and it's really hard to get it out. And one of the things, we had a bunch of roundtable discussions, and one of the things I found most striking, and they're talking to folks in industry and investors, like how do we get entrepreneurs interested in our IP? And we've invested millions of dollars in this, tens of thousands of hours. No one wants to do anything with it, even though this thing is interesting, right? And one of the problems that came up is we had one of the senior researchers there from one of the labs, and he was talking about some of the stuff he was working on. We asked him, we said, hey, if we licensed this IP and we found a founder who wanted to be the CEO of a company to take this and run with it, how much of your time, the researcher's time, could we have next year or over the next 3 or 4 years? Could we get 200 hours or 1,000 hours, or how much of your and your team's time could we get? We'd pay for it. But without that time, the patent is not worth that much, right? Like, I wasn't the researcher. I barely understand it. The CEO we bring in to start a company is barely going to understand it, even if they're experts in the space. You really need the research team. And the senior researcher said, honestly, like, I don't want to work on it, right? Like, he's moved on to the next project
That's
that
right.
he's doing research on. He's not rewarded for whatever happens in commercialization. He's rewarded for publishing papers and moving on to the next phase in research. And that's just that's a culture thing, right? And it's an incentive thing. Like, if the labs had real incentives you come in, you do research for 2 years, then you try and commercialize what you did, and that's part of your job. That's not the way it's set up. And so it's really hard to come in as industry and make use of what is probably valuable IP.
Yeah, it's a good point. Like, anytime I hear like Air Force Research Labs, they're probably the most notorious for it. They have we're going to solve this problem. Like, no, you're not. You're going to research the problem, and you're going to look at part of the problem, but that transition rate is terrible. And one of the reasons why is if that government funded research, in almost all cases, the government retains the IP, like Jake was saying, and so the people, the contractors, who worked on the project, they're treated as a services business, not a product company. So they do their engineers work on this program for a couple of years. They build this body of knowledge, and the government owns all the IP. And like Jake said, they move on to the next program, and like there's no incentive for them to do anything with that IP once it's developed. And so even though you have 3 or 4 defense companies who could have collectively been working on this project, no one actually has the intellectual property to do anything with it. The government needs to do something with it. And so there's an interesting discussion about like the government is very IP conservative, by it wants to own everything that it spends a dollar on, but it hardly ever does anything with all of that IP.
I guess if you change the culture, as you were talking about, really that's how you're going to get the additional like DARPA budget, in air quotes, of venture money to kind of join the ecosystem, right? Well, we spoke earlier, Mike, you said, that the paradigms flipped and we're like 79, 80% commercial R&D versus the 20% government or whatever the numbers were specifically, right? And how that's changed all of our processes within the Pentagon and the acquisitions and all the bureaucracy, right? You've got 30 or 40 years of just cemented in, baked in bureaucracy that has not changed to keep pace with that paradigm that's flipped. You have like a lot of the different, the new focus for defense venture and private equity and all that stuff. And I think you see a lot of the folks that recognize this, right? Like Jake or some of the other firms that are out there that have been in the space for a minute, like Harpoon or Decisive Point, or just all look at the defense ventures program within Shift. There's a whole collection of them, right? But there's such an opportunity, but it's a battle because of the culture. And that's really you almost have to do the government's work for them in their, as an action officer, and then submit it, and then let the government submit it and sign off on it and verify it. And that's just, almost an impossible thing to do for a young entrepreneur or startup or a small company that wants to take that IP out of the labs and then, try to commercialize it.
Yeah, and to your point, like the labs aren't focused on a solution. They're focused on developing a certain subcomponent of technology and how that fits in the bigger picture, and IP rights, services versus products, and that's really a problem. So and again, we go back to the money and the incentives and like why it matters. That money in the commercial market, unlike the federal, that $1, like you have to go like earn that investment. So you have to go like, if you give me the $1, this is what I'm going to do with it, and here's how I'm going to deliver value that you're going to make your money back. Where federal R&D is almost treated as a sunk cost, where no one can really track the metrics. Where's the return on investment? It's really muddy, and there's certain time horizons, and it's not linear. And I totally get it, but in the commercial market, you have to have that value proposition, and so that incentivizes the commercial R&D to be very solution oriented. and very product oriented. So I'm gonna use this money to develop this technology that turns into a product that now I can sell to someone to solve a problem, and that is different than how the federal government treats R&D.
I think that's fair. One of the articles that came out in the last week, I can't remember the title of the article. You sent it over, Mike. But the general thrust was that the government should stop funding the 6162, the very basic research funding, and should allocate more money, take it away from R&D.
Yeah, so that's a great transition point. So let's talk about the next op-ed, which is completely related to our conversation now. The title of it was "Should the Department of Defense Get Out of the R&D Business?" And this was a Bloomberg article, and I can't remember who wrote it, but it was an op-ed. So that's the tee up. Go ahead, Jake.
Yeah, it's a partner over at his name's Mislav. I just met him a couple weeks ago. Really smart guy. Totally disagree with the premise of the article. So the premise is the government is spending a lot of money in 6162. So it's like fundamental research, R&D, the R part of the D, and that money would be better spent on procurement, essentially. And if you were spending it in procurement, that would incentivize investors to come in and do more work in the space and startups to start building in the space because you're buying more stuff, right? The government's becoming a slightly better customer. I think the problem with that is that even though we just discussed what's wrong with the labs, right? Or like one of the labs challenges, because they develop all this stuff and all this great IP, they spend tens of millions or billions of dollars on it, and then it just sits on the shelf. The labs also do a lot of work that nobody in industry can afford to do or would do. And it's like really important for the country that it happens, even if we don't see the value for 10 or 20 years, right? So like as an example, Idaho National Labs has done a ton of research on nuclear fuel cycles. They've built a lot of capital infrastructure so that they can help industry test new reactor designs and like start pushing forward on like the nuclear energy space. No individual company can afford to do that kind of research and build those facilities as like an early stage startup. And so if like Idaho National Labs wasn't receiving the sort of the money to do that fundamental research, we'd never make advances in nuclear energy. I mean, all the national labs have something like that, where they have some really interesting, important capital infrastructure that takes a lot of investment that industry's never going to get to. So I think to the extent that we are funding those labs to do that kind of research, we might not see the benefit directly for quite a while. It's important, right? So how do you separate that research from stuff that's maybe less important that industry could do, but industry isn't doing because the labs are getting that money instead of industry? I think that's a pretty tough question, like how you draw that distinction. But I think if we defunded the labs, we'd be in deep trouble in 10, 20, 30 years.
We'll put a link in the show notes for all these articles we're talking about. The premise of this was, hey, we need to rethink how the government finances innovation. And so that's kind of the overview. I hate that word innovation, but that's the word that the author chose. So there's different ways and different time horizons, and the ones where you can't demonstrate that timeline for return on investment, like, hey, in 7 years, I'm going to have this, and here's my total addressable market. Here's all my finances. Here's what we're going to go capture. Here's our competition. When all those things are unknown because it's a greenfield territory, your early investment, that is an institutional cost to having an advanced society in the United States. That's kind of how I would think it. And that is the federal government should step in and definitely do that. But what the issue is that the author says, hey, in 2001, for every 66 cents spent on R&D, the government spent $1 on procurement, and that figure has been rising. And so this year it hit 84 cents to $1. And so if you continue charting that path, eventually it'll pass. By 2030, it'll pass a 1-to-1. What that means, if you look at like if the government was, or if the Department of Defense was a company, it is now a research organization because it spends more money on research than it does on actually buying things. If you guys remember, before the 2008 financial crisis, General Motors. So General Motors, what kind of company is General Motors?
Is this a quiz?
It is a quiz. Just popped into my head.
Before, it was a finance company before the financial crisis.
That's right. So it actually made more money financing vehicles than selling the vehicles. So on paper, it was a finance company that happened to sell cars. And the financial crisis made the government made them split apart. So GMAC was the credit arm of GM. They split off and they stood up a new financial internally. GMAC got rebranded to Ally. So if you see Ally financing for cars, that was formerly part of GM. But yeah, the point is, they were a finance company who happened to sell cars, even though we think of them as an automotive company. So it's kind of the same, I think, premise the author was trying to take is, hey, once this passes that parity, it's going to be a research organization. The solution is to cut out the R&D, keep the procurement. I disagree with it too. But my spicy take is the way that these contracts are all structured for government-funded R&D. It's borderline ridiculous. So let's say, and I'll use the Air Force example. So let's say that there was a line item in the budget, and the Air Force wants to do research and development on, product X, or not product X, but capability X. And the Congress goes, okay, we're going to give you $50 million. So that $50 million goes over into the Air Force. However, the companies that they put on contract to do that work, there is not $50 million that gets contracted out. Historically, it's about half. So whatever you see appropriated by Congress, 50% of that actually leaves the Air Force and goes to industry to do the thing that they ask Congress for the money. And the reason is there's a lot of overhead and passbacks and taxes and things that help fund the federal employees. And so that money that it gets obligated, some of the examples are pretty interesting when you look at how much money was appropriated by Congress, how much money was actually put on contract to industry to do that work. And the efficiency of the dollars is pretty low. My take would be what we probably would like to do is say there's firm fixed price contracts, which means that the government owns no risk. It's all on the contractor to deliver something at that price point on that time horizon. So as you go earlier in TRL, the risk profile goes up dramatically. But there's a knee in the curve. Where it is, I'm not sure. But if the Air Force said, hey, I want something at TRL 4 by this date, where are my proposals? Here's the money, here's the timeline, and deliver it with that money on that timeline. That shifts all the burden onto industry to manage their programs efficiently to do it. So I think there's a way there. There's some more interesting contracting things that we could shift the risk and the opportunity, quite frankly, to industry versus the government. And again, the incentives, if you're incentivized to do something, to deliver something, you know what you're getting into, versus if you're treated like an engineering services company, you're just along for the ride. You have no idea where this program is going to go. You're just, it could be years and years of committing your resources to help the government with this R&D problem, but you're never actually going to get to a point where you're going to generate any revenue for your investors. So that was a long, spicy take. So I'm going to pause there.
I do not think that the DoD should get out of the R&D business, right? As you're talking about, the 50% of what's appropriated actually makes it to do the work. I think there's a lot of opportunity for like defragging that, right? And actually being efficient and reducing the overhead. I mean, even whenever I'm sure there's numerous program offices out there, contracting officers that are like, hey, I really want to do this thing, right? But the way our system's set up is we're going to put out a solicitation, and even though a company is not qualified at all to deliver that thing or say, build that thing, they're going to put in a proposal because it's just what they do, right? And then it goes into a protest thing, and then it goes on down the line, and so there's so many possible like pitfalls, right? Or workarounds that increase that overhead. You're paying pass-throughs on subcontracts or, percentages for acquisition assistance and things like that. Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of stuff, right? But also the other thing is there's been notable improvements since, 2019 when AFWERX started. I guess it was really late 18, but whenever they were there in the open topic and where we've kind of starting to get our sea legs underneath us for that. But like the POM cycle and the transition stuff from that, we're still 3-4 years away from anything that's really just been happening last year with AppFid and all these other things and a bunch of different firms where we've started to see traction and we see a lot of promise on the near term horizon. Of course, the government's going to reinvest and reprogram money to increase in research and development and in those areas where we're seeing promising, activities for the future. We just have to wait for that POM cycle and the programming thing to catch up in a lot of ways, right? But, I don't think overall transitioning technology isn't isn't that difficult, right? We make it a lot harder than what it is. But at the end of the day, if you legitimately understand your government customer, if you understand the technology and understand what their needs are, and if you can understand a lot of considerations, like in the JSIDs, there's the .ml PFP things and considerations are there. But if you run through those as like a checklist and you look at the doctrine and the organization and the training and non-material options and just all down the list, right? I won't bore you with the details, but you can understand so much more about what needs to be done. And then it's just a shopping chore, right? It's going out and finding things or staging companies or managing and orchestrating the timeline and positioning companies for success down the line. Phase 3 authority from the cyber program's a godsend, right? Because you can avoid those future protests. You can avoid those things. I mean, if you're using these tools wisely, the transition will occur if it has, the equivalent of a government product market fit.
Yeah.
It's not that hard. And I mean, one of the companies that I've worked with, they have on their own, they have a $500 million IDIQ to build mobile apps at a tactical edge, right? And they're the only ones on that vehicle, and it's going to get renewed. That's after that renewal happens, that's $1 billion in ceiling for them that they were able to do things for. And it's just insane, right? So it will happen, and it does happen, but it's just a matter of you have to understand things and the unknowns that are out there.
Just backing up a little bit for some acronym overview. So I think I'll try to catch them all here.
Yeah, sorry.
Nope, that's all right. So POM is Program Objective Memorandum. That is the process of internally requesting money, and that's part of the PBBE, Programming, Planning, Budgeting, and Execution process. We talked a little bit about that in last episode. Basically, right now, as we're recording this, we're sitting in fiscal year 23. The fiscal year 24 budget is already locked up, and the fiscal year 25 budget is in final draft. So that's the timelines that you're talking with. So if you want something to get something requested into a budget for funded, it's going to take a couple years, and that's part of the problem. And there's some workarounds and shortcuts and on ramps and off ramps too, but that's kind of how the process is built from the 60s, which is a whole different thing. We talked a lot about that in the last episode. JSIDs is the requirements process, joint capability, something. It's a requirements process.
Integration and development.
There you go.
Joint capabilities, integration and development system.
Yeah. And then the .mil PF or .mil PFP is the acronym for the process of making sure that you've checked all the blocks of how you get something from concept to combat, to include leadership, doctrine, training, maintenance, that kind of stuff. So yeah, you have to address all of those aspects, and that's why it exists, to make sure that you can field something and it's actually fieldable. And so just because you have a high TRL, something in the lab, does not mean it can go to the field. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that has to happen. So speaking of money, there's a looming fight over spending cuts, and we're going to tread carefully here because this is not a political show, and we will not get political. But if you're not tracking the drama from the white building with the funny dome on top from the last couple of weeks, there is a Speaker of the House. He was elected eventually, and I forgot how many times it took, 15, 16, something like that times. Doesn't matter.
15.
There you go. After 15 times, he won the speakership in Speaker McCarthy. And one of the reasons that he won it is he made some concessions. And those concessions are $130 billion in spending reductions. The Republicans, who now have the majority in the House, they have gone out and said that is non-defense discretionary spending, which is now, I'm having nightmares of like 2011 all over again, which led to which is the Budget Control Act, which led to sequestration in 2013 because the two political parties could not agree on defense versus non-defense spending cuts. One of them wanted a 1-for-1, one of them didn't, and no one could agree, and that triggered the sequestration because they could not agree, and that's what led to the top line draconian cuts across the portfolio of programs with no rhyme or reason, because it was supposed to be so terrible. Clearly, no politician would let this happen. And clearly, they were wrong because it happened, and I lived through it, and it was terrible. But the interesting part, few things here, I'd like to get your takes on it. that $130 billion, I actually did a little bit of research, and I don't think they just pulled it out of thin air. So here's my hot take of where the number came from. And I have no context of other talking points for them. I just went and did some research. So there is a budget deficit. We have a huge debt problem. And the context is the government spent last year, the federal government spent $6.27 trillion, but it collected $4.9 trillion in revenue. You end up with $1.37 trillion. If you just take 10% of that, you get $130 billion. So I think you're just looking at a 10% reduction of the deficit spending. That's where I think it came from.
I don't know if you have the data in front of you, but how much of the discretionary spending the U.S. does every year is the Department of Defense's budget? I know it's quite large.
It's 50.
It's a large piece of that pie.
It's 50%. So if you look at the long-term projections historically, there's a thing called discretionary spending and non-discretionary spending. And of that, $6.27 trillion that was spent. So the non-discretionary spending is spending that happens automatically. It's written into law to be in perpetuity until it's not. And those are things like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. Those are non-discretionary. Discretionary means that there is appropriations bills that have to be passed, and every year Congress has to authorize and appropriate that money to be spent. And in that latter category, that's where you have defense and non-defense spending. That's where all the discussion is. No one is talking about the bigger part of the pie, right? That 6.27 trillion, probably 65-ish percent, 70% is that money that's just automatic. And so we're really over arguing about, call it 30% of the pie. And of that 30% of the pie of discretionary spending, it's about 50-50. So half of all that is defense spending and the other half is non-defense. So defense becomes the big talking point because it's the biggest piece of that last slice of the pie. Interestingly enough, when you actually include interest on debt that the federal government owns, you look at the long-term projections, as we get more debt, the interest that we have to pay on the debt goes up, and that is not linear. So when you look at some projections by like the end of the decade, so 2030, 2040, 2050, in that pie, the inflation piece of that pie starts to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And at some point, that's going to have to be dealt with. And I think that's why next crisis around the corner be damned. It is a bipartisan issue to get a control of government spending. And that sets up, what are we going to spend the money on? What are we going to fund? What are we not going to fund? The Republicans have come out and said, well, there won't be cuts to spending, but there will be savings. So what they're looking at is cuts in legacy force structure and really overhead. So the bloated bureaucracy problem that the Department of Defense has grown to love in the past 40 years. I worked in the Pentagon for a few years, and here's my hot take. In World War II, at its peak, 33,000 people worked in the Pentagon. And we had a massive Air Force. We had a massive Army. We had a massive Navy. We didn't even have computers back then. Now we have a small Navy, a tiny Air Force, and an average Army, and we have computers. And you know how many people work in the Pentagon today? 33,000 people. So there's somewhere to start, in my opinion. But I'll stop there.
Well, I mean, you kind of need that many people, right, to shed risk, right? So the bureaucracy doesn't come down and hammer you whenever you are doing something or you make a risky call and it ends up not working out the way that you thought it was going to be. You don't want to end up losing your job, right?
You can't get fired from government service unless you do something that's illegal, and then you get prosecuted. And even then, there's probably a multi-year process because you're unionized. And there's plenty of civil services that they just flog a mirror, take a paycheck. On the other hand, there are some amazing Americans doing amazing work. And man, I wish you could just double their salary. They're just one in a million, amazing people. But there's got to be a better way. Once you hire someone, getting rid of them there's issues with it, obviously.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, in the headquarters that I worked at, it was, there's a saying where it's you could chop off a third of it and it would probably run better than what it does today, right? Because those people don't really contribute or do much. I will say though, shout out to those people when you really want to do something and get things done. They're a fantastic hack because all you have to do is do their job for them. You you could submit the work on to them, and then they just turn around and push it forward as if they did it, right? So if you want to put a critical program through, or you want to do something that you want to kind of move a little fast in some ways, those certain types of those people are really, really, really valuable for you. But
hashtag bureaucracy hack. That's
Yeah.
a good one.
Hashtag bureaucracy hack. That is definitely a bureaucracy hack. We're talking about like thawing out parts of the frozen middle, not digging your way through like a tunnel through it.
Yeah, I mean, you gotta make sure you have those back channels. Still you want to preserve them, because that's how a lot of stuff gets done.
The reason why we're talking about it for this, I think it's going to set up a showdown between the House and the Senate, which means that nothing's going to happen. If you ever watch the old cartoon, How a Bill Becomes a Law, everything has to originate in the House. So I think you're going to see the House start originating a bunch of things. It's going to stall in the Senate. There's going to be things that are going to be held hostage, like the debt ceiling, the annual appropriations acts. So there's going to be a lot of stalling as we try to get some concessions from one side or the other. But at the end of the day, I think everyone agrees that we have to figure out a plan to balance the budget for spending from the federal government. What is the best way to do it? And, how can we start at what are the things that both sides can agree with? And then you start diverging. The problem with politics is you usually get your points by building up momentum on your side first, which means you're opening shots or I'm right, you're wrong. And then, eventually it kind of goes into the middle for compromise. Turns out when the U.S. government was built, it's structured to be a system of compromise. And so when you start out saying that you're not going to compromise, nothing happens.
Well, it's hard too whenever you have two and a half Congresses, right, for each palm cycle that's out there. So re-elections occur twice or sometimes, 3 times.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, the challenge is too, right? Like as you highlighted, Mike, the deficit is a national security challenge. Like, it's not today a national security challenge, but in the next 10 or 15 years, the deficit will start to impact our ability to fund the DoD more sustainably, right? Or other important government programs. And so we're in a place, particularly a place in a time in the world, right, where we've got everything that's going on in Ukraine. We have Taiwan 1, 2, 3 years out, right? Who knows? But everyone's worried about that. And so there's pressure to increase defense spending. Defense spending this year went up, despite the fact that there was definitely talk about some cuts to defense spending. It went the other direction, probably for good reason. But we can't do it indefinitely, right? So we've got to find places to start cutting. And where that is, I don't know. Maybe it is in the building. Maybe it's finally divesting ourselves of some old legacy platforms that are hanging on by a fingernail. We got to figure out something though.
Yeah. All right. So speaking of like finding where to cut money and investments and doing it wisely, if you guys were traveling recently and had to deal with the FAA NOTAM outage, you felt it. So for those who don't travel or live under a rock or don't know, on January 11th, on that Wednesday morning, the FAA's NOTAM system went down and it ended up grounding all U.S. flights for a period of time. And that was the first time that the FAA had mandated a grounding since 9/11. So this is not something that usually happens. And it was about a 90-minute delay. And so this little snafu caused almost 10,000 delays and 1,300 flight cancellations. For perspective, that's roughly half of all total flights for the entire day in the United States. And this was a 90 minutes in the morning. Okay. Backing up. So what is a NOTAM? Well, if you're old, you probably reference NOTAM. It stands for Notice to Airmen. If you're younger or you pay attention to the news, that has been now changed to Notice to Air Mission back in 2021. So it's more inclusive. So Notice to Air Mission is NOTAM. What it is it's basically what we use for pre-flight planning. So we get the weather. What's the weather going to look like in the sky? And then we have NOTAMs, which is what's the situation on the ground. And so that can be, I have runway closures. There's some navigational aids that are out. There's a military exercise going on. So there's a bunch of aircraft flying through the airspace. So I don't want to fly there. Lasers, the president's flying, air shows, all those things. And what it's really, really important for is the airfield that I'm going to, what are the conditions on the field? And so not only is the airfield open, but there's like runway construction, this taxiway is closed, that kind of stuff, and my alternate field. So if I can't land there, where can I land? And then so having that information before you get airborne is a requirement before you fly. Well, that system went down. No NOTAM equals no fly, basically. So that's really what happened. And the official response, enough time has passed, we have it, is, quote, the agency determined that a data file was damaged by personnel who failed to follow procedures, unquote. My take, it's, I'd say it's personal incompetence, but it gets worse. So the follow-on of this is that an engineer replaced one file with another, didn't realize that the file he uploaded was corrupt, and he didn't realize the mistake. And then as the system started crashing, the IT staff was kind of running around trying to figure out what had gone wrong, but the engineer who actually made the error is kind of sitting there like, I don't know what's going on. This is weird. So finally they figured out like, hey, who's the last person who touched that? Like, oh, that guy in the corner. Hey, guy in the corner, come here. What did you do? Like, go undo it. And so they went back and were able to put another file back onto that database that was not corrupt. So the engineers and IT teams then had to go back through a bunch of other systems to make sure, like, number one, how did one person with one file crash an entire national airspace system? So that kind of tells you like how crappy the system is. Like, where are the redundancies and the checks and the processes? So I think it's a process breakdown. It's a personal proficiency breakdown. It is definitely an infrastructure breakdown.
Who needs adversaries when you've got systems like that, right?
Oh yeah,
I say that all the time. Like, we're our worst insider threat ourselves. Like, we have to get out of our own way.
So let me tell you this. This is I went down a rabbit hole actually looking up some more information on this, because I'm like, well, that's the news, but like, where's this is the merge. Like, I can't just tell you the news. I have to go like try to find out something else to make it more entertaining. So I did. And this is what I found out. So there was a defense reporter who actually was trying to get some archive NOTAMs. So, hey, like last month, like, was this navigate up? Was it not? Because when you go and you enter your information, it just spits you out real time. And they couldn't figure it out. So they reached out to the FAA, and the FAA said, basically like, here's the website. Good luck. It's horrible. So the reporter is like, my take was initially reading that, I'm like, that's funny. And then I was like, I have used the NOTAMs. My hot take was like, I don't think the UI, like, I don't remember it changing in like the 15 years that I've used this website. That's how old it is. I'm like, that was my like off the top of my head. And then I went down a rabbit hole. So the NOTAMs website that you actually go get the NOTAMs for the civilians is called notams.aim.faa.gov. That is the website that actually went down that civilians use for all their NOTAMs. Okay, so it's an faa.gov domain. If you're in the military, the website you go to get NOTAMs is notams.faa.gov. You would think that's the civilian URL. That is not. That is the military URL. So that directs you to what's called the Defense Internet NOTAM Service. The fact that it has internet in the acronym should be your first clue. Like, this is probably an old system. So it's called DINS. The military uses it. And for anyone who's concerned, and interestingly, it shares the same data on the same domain, but the military system DINS never actually went down, only the civilian one. So who knows how that's possible. So it has the same domain, the same info, but one broke and one didn't. And then I kind of went down another rabbit hole. I'm like, well, yeah, DINS, the one with the internet in the acronym, I know this is old. This got to be old. So how old? So then I went down another rabbit hole. And I clicked on the About section. You can go to this website, notams.faa.gov. If you scroll to the bottom, it actually has an About section. And if you click on the About section, this pop-up appears, and you'll get this gem. Quote, use current web browsers, such as those from Microsoft or Netscape. Users can retrieve real-time NOTA data for domestic, international, and military NOTAMs. I'm like, well, current web browsers, Microsoft or Netscape? Like, wait a minute, that's got to be old. And then I went down another rabbit hole, and yada, yada, yada. Netscape ended in February of 2008. That's how old that website is. And so my guess was 15 years. I was just, like 1 or 2 years off. That's old.
Well, it says on the little pop-up that you get, it's not styled or anyway. It's just basic HTML, right? And the thing, but it's It says last updated October 2015, and they didn't bother to take out Netscape.
By updated, they updated the year. They didn't do any work. So this is the reason why we're mentioning it. It goes back to federal spending, and I'll get Jake's take in just a second. So there's a thing called the FAA Reauthorization Act. The FAA just can't exist on its own. Every 5 years, it goes back to Congress to get reapproved for reauthorization. And the reason that exists is they go back and they kind of look at the budget. What's the investment? What's the plan? What's the path you want to take? And it allows Congress to kind of keep their hands on the wheel. Not as much every year like the DoD, but the FAA about every 5 years. So that one was the last time was reauthorized in 2018, which means this year the FAA Reauthorization Act has to be reauthorized, which means that there's going to be a ton of hearings. I mean, it couldn't happen at a better time that the year it's going to get reauthorized, the very beginning of the congressional session, the entire NOTAM system crashes, the national airspace transportation. So I think this is going to set us up nicely for a good discussion on critical infrastructure for the United States.
Never let a crisis go to waste, right?
All right, so let's put a pin in NOTAMs, and again, that's going to be on the Hill. There's something else that's going to be on the Hill. It's in the news feed right now. We're going to not talk about politics, but we are going to talk about some classified documents that were found in a garage next to a Corvette. So, Jake, you want to take us away?
All right. So this isn't a political show. I'm going to try and not be political, although very hard given the context here. For those who have been living under a rock for the last week or 2 weeks, classified documents were found in current President Biden's garage next to a Corvette, and I believe also in an old office of his. These are documents from the Biden-Obama years. This is made particularly complicated, obviously, by the fact that former President Trump held on to a number of classified documents at Mar-a-Lago, and there's currently a pending investigation into what's going on there. So before we talk about the specifics of either case, I'll put my lawyer hat on since I was a lawyer. I guess I still am a lawyer. For every crime, there are a number of elements that go into whether or not someone has created a crime. And those elements fall into one of three categories usually. One category is sort of the status of the person who is accused of committing a crime, right? So most crimes don't actually have a status element, but some do. So for instance, there are some crimes that only active duty service members can break, like because laws only apply to them, or some crimes that only elected officials can break because the law only applies to the elected official. So that's a status element. Then there are act elements. That's called actus rei. So you have to take an act that's outlined in the elements of the crime. In the case of a murder, it is killing someone. If you haven't killed someone, there is no act. You're not guilty of that crime. And then the third category of element is intent, mens rea. So most crimes, though not all crimes, require some element of criminal intent.
Yeah, so keeping classified documents in your garage. Pam and Tommy thought the same thing about their tape, and we don't have that end up. But I'd say if you're in the military and you were in these situations, you'd have been they would have just find something, Article 134, which is like the general article, which is I think you did something wrong, but I can't find an article that fits. Like slap it at them. Article 134, take away your security clearance, half month's pay for whatever, brought up on charges, take your rank away. And that would all happen by the end of the week.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really speak to the specifics and the elements and, the legal kind of stuff, right? But I will say that there's a general, trust and confidence level of this thing, right? Because the average person isn't going to spend, hours of their day trying to research things and get stuff. I mean, you can see that just by the fact that, so many people just kind of hear talking points and then, that kind of forms their opinions and things. And then that, that gets repeated and so on and so forth and how those ideas spread. Right. But there's a retention issue, right? There's this upcoming budget issue that we're talking about for national security. There's all sorts of, things that go into the culture of things. Right. And it's like, at some point we have to, walk the talk, right? We have to lead by example. And if we're going to have these rules or we're going to have these, processes in place, whether it's for classified or just, operations on a daily basis, right? there really should be some standardization and some predictability about how things are enforced, and not, a selective enforcement kind of thing, right? And when you factor in all of those intangible and squishy kind of elements to this thing, right? I think it makes for a nightmare case for, Merrick Garland and the DOJ, and how they're going to prosecute things and what are they going to do. And there's so much of second, third, and follow on orders of effects down the line. And of course you're never going to please everybody, right? I mean, the country's so divided right now. It's just crazy. But, at some point, by and large, right, we need to come together as a country, have some shared ideals, and actually, if we're ever going to get out of these ways, these crises and these things that we find ourselves into, right, it's not going to be through division. It's going to be through cohesion. That's where I would say is maybe, we have a lot more in common with everybody than what we think, right? And then what things appear to be, and what, the media or other kind of elements out there might want people to believe.
That is a great summary for unification. I'll pile on with some lightheartedness, and then we'll talk about we'll give it back to Tim to talk chat GPT. So two things. I got two stories with two vignettes, and they're about overclassification. So who cares what's in the document, but the classification of the document is it's classified. Okay, whether or not it should be classified is a whole different discussion. So there's an overclassification issue that's been pervasive throughout the Department of Defense. My favorite was a top secret email that said "Happy Birthday." Like, there's nothing top secret about telling someone happy birthday, but it's classified top secret because it was sent on a network and it auto stamped it with top secret. I'm like, well, it's not top secret. I know your birthday and happy birthday. I'll do a war story real quick. On one of my deployments, a dark and stormy night, and this particular dark and stormy night also had wind. And those who don't know, it's better now, but back then you had to print out all of these like papers to take with you to the jet. And so you're at night with a flashlight flying around in a $100 million fighter, reading printed out paper documents. In these documents, they default like everything is classified. Like nothing is unclassified. It's all classified. And so one of these, in this windy night on the flight line, as he's walking out to the jet, this gust of wind gets the better of him, and some of his classified documents get blown down the flight line, and there's no catching them. Like, there is no catching it. It's gone. So these piles of papers that are just go flying down the flight line, and they're like we'll have maintenance go run after him. Like, you're gonna miss your mission. Like, just we'll figure it out. There's two people in the cockpit. The other guy has stuff. We'll figure it out. While they're airborne, the papers make their way back to the ops desk, the ops supervisor, and he's like, "Hey, we collected all the papers. Here they are." And they're like, "Well, the pilot's airborne. He doesn't know we have his papers." And one of the papers was the tanker tracks. So all of the where you have to go, these like big rectangles in the sky, where you go to meet tankers. The names of the tanker tracks were classified, but as soon as you took off, you would talk on the radio about all the tanker track names, which was the dumbest thing ever, that they were labeled secret if you printed them out, but you could talk about them all over the place of who was going to meet you where and when. And so we're like, "Hey, we got it." So, and our commander kind of got in on it. So he comes back and he's like, "Hey, go talk to the commander." Goes to the commander and he's like, "Hey, understand you've had a leak of classified information. We've had inadvertent disclosure. We've had to fill out paperwork. We've had to talk to the Air Operations Center." And he's like, "Yes, sir. Yes, sir." He's like, "Okay, by the time you come to work tomorrow, you need to come up with new names for all of the tanker tracks in Afghanistan." And he's like, and here is the list of the like 27,000 words you're not allowed to use because they've already been burned. And they're like, "What?" And so he spent like hours coming up with like these names for these tanker tracks as a joke. So lesson learned, don't lose your secrets. That's the best way to teach your lesson. Oh man, I miss it. Okay, let's talk about let's go back to Tim and talk about what is going on in ChatGPT. There's a few things, and let's get to it.
Yeah, I mean, so ChatGPT, since I think it's kind of growing and permeating across the culture, if you will. One of the coolest things that I think that I've actually started looking at is the integration of it. So it's not necessarily ChatGPT, which we talked about was basically the 3.5 model, right? But the previous model, GPT-3, is actually, everybody's been building on it. The APIs are out there, programmers and folks that are tinkering with it. I mean, that thing is integrated across a lot of different things. So you can actually integrate it into Google Sheets now. You can integrate it in through Zapier, which is a really good automation tool and things as well. I mean, there's all sorts of different paired connections and things you can do. I think one of the most notable things is that, it kind of along the same line of overclassification, right? And being uncomfortable with information being out there and things that you see the government do, is that there's been articles in the news of schools that have actually banned or blocked access to ChatGPT, right? Because some students are, asking it questions and it's drafting essays. There was a version change where the actual, model won't put out the essay, or at least it'll try to avoid doing that, right? There's, I think, some workarounds based on how you can interact with the prompt and the questions you could ask. And then, even now there's a plagiarism tool that can look at what has been generated and run it through the algorithm. You can see if it was essentially AI generated or not, which is all kind of cool. So a lot of different developments, a lot of new features and functions that people are taking, that thing. If we want to talk about it from like a basic research from the government, right, with the labs and things, nobody knew that we needed this thing, a year ago. Some smart people were working on it. They've been training it for years or however long that they've been doing things, right, that to get the model up to date. And then, at some point, there's a catalyst that occurs and this technology comes out and you're like, holy cow, how did we live without it? So
Yeah, it's funny, back in episode 3 when we were talking about this, I think it's like, hey, it's not even designed to be a search engine, but you could use it as a search engine. I didn't know when we were actually just talking about that, I didn't know that Microsoft has spent $3 billion in the last 3 years helping OpenAI develop. They were basically their backer for their compute. So all that money is going into these high performance computing, HPC, to actually run the AI to deliver, to build the model and to deliver some results. So I tell you that to tell you, based on this thing going viral, Microsoft is in serious talks about spending $10 billion more in OpenAI to take the GPT and integrate it into Bing to then take on the Google search engine. So that is going to be extremely disruptive. It'll be really curious to see how that evolves in the next 12 months between the search engines. Google's kind of had the reign on it based on prioritizing clicks and indexing. But now we have this new way of getting information. We talked a little bit before about, where is it getting the information from? How is it validated? What's the source of truth? So I think there's going to be a lot going on in that. And Microsoft, I didn't realize this. Again, going down a rabbit hole. Microsoft actually started. So OpenAI also has DALL-E, which is like image. So it's a generative AI. So this, instead of generating kind of conversational through chat, this one generates images. So I want Jake in a Halloween costume on a beach at sunset, and the more details you put in, the more details you get out of the image. So you could just type what you want it to see and be extremely descriptive, and it will generate AI images for you. So Microsoft actually started incorporating DALL-E image creations into its Bing search engine. That's already started to happen. So that'll be really cool. And then I also didn't realize that GitHub, which is owned by Microsoft, that's a public online kind of repository for programmers. There's a tool called Copilot, and it's kind of like ChatGPT for nerds. And so it helps as people are writing code to build smartphone apps and like other software. As you start writing the code, Copilot basically starts suggesting the rest of the code as you type it. So it's like autocomplete for a search engine, but it's for actually writing code, which is kind of crazy.
Going to commoditize a lot of the specific knowledge industry that was out there before, right? I mean, I've played with it a little bit, and it'll generate SharePoint code for you. Well, GPT will. I'm sure Copilot is a whole different ballgame, right?
Yeah.
One of the most cool things I think that I'm looking at it right now in terms of time saving and what am I doing is, from an industry perspective, there's a website or an app really and a Google extension called Fireflies. So fireflies.ai, and you can download the Chrome extension, and whenever you're invited to a Zoom meeting or things like that, you can invite this app to the meeting, and it'll actually transcribe everything that is said during that meeting. Obviously, there's security classification concerns and things you can't don't want to invite the thing and transcribe stuff whenever that stuff applies, right? But just in normal everyday kind of meetings, you kind of have that thing there. It'll transcribe whatever you're doing. And then you can actually take that through Zapier, or even if you wanted to do it manually, you can just copy and paste the transcript, run it through ChatGPT, and ask it to summarize the main points, the next action items, and things like that. And it'll actually generate a summary, and then it will email it out. From an automation standpoint, that would actually occur. You could set up the stuff in Zapier to where Fireflies will record the AI. It'll transcribe it because you already have the prompt pre-generated. And then you can have it set to integrate with your email system, so it'll automatically send out all of the notes and everything that you just talked about in your meeting instantaneously whenever you're done, saving hours of time for post-meeting kind of administrative cleanup stuff.
What do you think the odds are that the Firefly servers are in China?
Right there, hosted by TikTok, ByteDance, right?
Yeah.
Fairly high.
Probably fairly high. Yeah. So.
Yeah. There's so a lot of founders these days send their decks to VCs and folks that they're trying to work with through a service called DocuSend, right? So you upload your deck to DocuSend. DocuSend basically turns your deck into a website and then creates a URL for it. And so what founders do, instead of sending a PDF or a document, they send a URL. And then investors or whoever they're sending it to clicks through the URL, and then they can look through your deck slide by slide, basically on a website. The reason founders do this is it gives them a bunch of controls, right? So you can make that password protected so people can't pass your deck around to competitors or VCs you don't want to see it. And you can also see, what slides people are lingering on. You get a bunch of data that's helpful for entrepreneurs. I imagine DocuSend these days is used by a lot of folks other than entrepreneurs, but obviously in my job, that's the context in which I see it. Now, VCs generally hate DocuSend or getting decks in DocuSend, because what I want a record of what the company was doing and what they were saying and the story they were telling on the day they sent it. And I want to be able to access that in my files 6 months or a year from now, the next time I talk to a founder. And if you send me a link, oftentimes the founder will change the deck and they keep it updated, so the story is always changing, or they'll take it down, right? So I lose my ability to create a proprietary database of people I've talked to and what was going on at the time. So what a lot of venture investors will do is there is a website called Deck to PDF, where you take a DocuSend link and you drop it in Deck to PDF, and you hit convert, and it just converts it into a PDF document. It's just like a simple URL. It's like the old Google search page, right? There's no bells and whistles. It's just you drop a URL in and it spits out a PDF. Done a lot of work trying to figure out who actually runs Deck to PDF, and I can't. But if you think about that as just a simple utility, it is an amazing intelligence gathering tool, because they have thousands of investors and entrepreneurs and business people dropping DocuSend links, probably other URLs in there. And that data is being collected on a server somewhere. And I'd be pretty surprised if that server were sitting in the US somewhere. I think it's probably outside the borders here.
So let's talk about Adept AI. Tim, you dropped a link for this, and I'd heard about this probably 2 days before you dropped the link. So you want to tell everyone how that's the next level of it's not Zapier, it's the next level of basically a virtual assistant 2.0.
I haven't really gone too far down the rabbit hole on it other than just seeing it, and I love actually. Side note, right? If you listen to the previous episodes, I actually really enjoy part of my day now finding things on TikTok and dropping them in our group link here, right? Just because it's a TikTok video, and Jake is advocating for his spicy takes on them. I'll let everybody go back and get those. But so that's kind of a point of awesomeness for me, is every time I see the TikToks, But
and you guys don't realize this. Every time Tim drops a link in our group chat and the URL says starts with TikTok, Jake dies a little bit inside.
I do. I have to go get my burner phone so I can click on the link. Kills me.
So I know that I could be making things easier, but it's almost like punishment for him beating me in fantasy football. So I like to torture him a little bit, but
Yeah, he totally dominated. And actually, someone that came up to me after episode 3 aired and go, "Hey, did you what happened with Tom Brady?" It was like right after that episode aired. I had benched Tom Brady because I gave up on him, and then he just like dominated. I was like, my luck,
because he got a new girrgirlfriend, right?
Mike
Did
Evans
he?
had
Is that what
3
happened?
touchdowns in that game.
Yeah, I know. I don't even think I think I'm in the middle of the pack, so I didn't end up last. So as long as I'm at the wedge in fantasy football, it's okay.
I haven't won the league in like a decade, so I'm pretty excited.
Yeah, that's
Nice.
good.
Congratulations. But yeah, go back to ADAPT, right? Or yeah, so I mean, it's
Or
a
adept?
thing
Is it
right, where
adept?
you have
I think it's saying it
adept
wrong.
or adept or adept probably is the right
Adept
way
is
to
probably
go
the right
about it,
word because
but
that's actually a real word. Adept is something I just made up. So let's
adept
go with
is my I spent
AI.
time in ADAPT, right?
Yeah.
No, but this is so adept is really a browser extension that will, you can just give it guidance and it will take action, right? It's called Action Transformer. ACT1 is the model on it, but it's using what they call like general intelligence is the system that a human can do in front of a computer. So if you're just copying and pasting things from one thing to the other, or you're doing just any kind of things that you can communicate in a in a natural language kind of way to the model, it will do those things for you, and it actually will record and learn through machine learning what you're doing whenever you're actually completing the task, so much so that after you complete it a few times and it's there, that it can at its end state will actually just do those tasks for you based off of you just giving it guidance to do.
So some examples that I saw using this, just to give some example of how it's different than ChatGPT. So this is when you integrate it with some accounts, it can basically do the menial things that you have to do. Like, hey, I have to send someone an email, and I want to CC this person, and all the things in your mind you're thinking of, and you click the buttons and you type up everything, and then you click send. So think of the 15 to 20 clicks, the different windows you have to open, the things you have to log in, what you have to type. It does all of that for you. So think of like, if you asked Alexa or Siri something, but you were tasking it to do something, and then it would go in and log in your accounts and do everything for you. So whether it's ordering stuff or sending emails, paying bills, it does everything for you, to include spreadsheet work. And so you could basically just type in, make me a formula for this, and this, and it does all of the work for you. It makes the formulas, puts the stuff in Excel, and so it does all the stuff. If you don't have that level of expertise, you can explain what you want it to do, and it will attempt or complete what you wanted it to do. So you don't actually have to learn the process; you just have to know what you want.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole industry of offshore outsourcing for simple, repetitive tasks. Think of what you might have had an executive assistant do 30 or 40 years ago. Here in the States, a lot of that work has been offshored to the Philippines and other countries where wages are a little bit lower. I think that industry is going to be hit really hard, right? Because those folks are doing fairly simple tasks that I think Adept will be able to completely replicate. So look at all of my LinkedIn contacts, find everybody I know, within 30 miles of, Tampa Bay, Florida, and, provide a list of that to me because I'm going to make a trip and I want to see who I should touch base with. Right.
Yeah.
Normally,
That's so much
you
better
would
than
have given
going
that
like,
to-
hey, I'm in town. And you send a message out to, thousands of people when it might apply to like 10. Yeah.
Yep.
All right. So wrapping things up for the episode, I wanted to end on ChatGPT for a reason. So do you guys remember back in episode 3, we were talking about ChatGPT, and I kind of just thought to myself, and then I thought out loud, do you think ChatGPT could write me a rap song? And Jake said, oh yeah, no problem. And we kind of moved on. So I got to thinking, and I did. I asked ChatGPT, write me a short rap song about the world's best fighter pilot. And I clicked it, and it populated. I'm like, oh, that's pretty cool. But I'm like, you know what? That's not a song. Those are words. So at best, they're lyrics or a poem. And so I thought to myself, self, what else? What would Tim do? And so I opened up another browser tab. I typed in for AI voices, and I clicked on like the first or second one, whatever one that wasn't sponsored. And I took those lyrics. This is all free, by the way. I took those lyrics from ChatGPT and copied them and pasted them into another online AI platform. And it basically had a drop down of voices. I picked the first one because it was numeric alpha, and 50 Cent was the first one. And I clicked generate. And so now I have 50 Cent singing or rapping a short rap song about the world's best fighter pilot, written by ChatGPT. Well, then I thought to myself, you need some beats. And so I opened up another browser, again, in the life of Tim, of what he would do. And I searched YouTube for a beat, like a hip hop beat. And like literally the first result that showed up in YouTube, I'm like, that'll work. I took the beat and I mixed it in with the 50 Cent AI, so the generative 50 Cent. And so with like no like beats per minute, no constraints like that, this whole process, it took me longer to explain it than actually what I did. So I probably spent 5 minutes, maybe 7 minutes total, definitely less than 10 minutes, and like zero editing, just click, click. And that's how I generated the song, which you're going to hear now in the outro. And so thanks for listening. Hit the 5-star review, hit us up on our website, and sign up for the newsletter. And until next time, this is Demerge with 50 Cent giving you a shout out. See ya.
Anabolic beats.
He's the best in the sky, no one can deny. He can't let me know what outgun and outfleet. He's got the skills, he's got the speed. He's the world's best fighter pilot. That's all you need to know. World's best fighter pilot. You got it all. World's best fighter pilot. Standing tall, trained for the best. He's passed every test he's ready for. Action, he's at his best. He's a true warrior. It's a master of the skies. He's the world's best fighter pilot. No one can deny.